So, we're live to the nations, are we? Hey up. I knew I should have had my hair permed. I want to pick up on something I was talking about a month ago. It's not like a part two. It's more of kind of an extension from it. I was talking a month ago about why we don't get more involved, why we don't step up more. And I don't mean that just in the church situation. I mean that in the kingdom. Why we don't actually achieve more. And one of the things they're suggesting is just like the temple in Jerusalem, where the people are sitting in the people's courts and the presence of God is in the Holy of Holies, and between them are this special group of people, priests, who are set apart. And so people think they've got to be set apart to actually get involved. Even though we know that's not true anymore, and we've all been made priests, we still see somehow that there is a special group of people who are set apart to do the things of God. There are somehow levels of Christians. There are ordinary, common garden Christians like us who kind of just sit in the congregation. And then there are better quality Christians, and then proper Christians, and then at the top there are superstar Christians. I don't know if anybody reads these kind of testimony books that are meant to encourage us about guys who have, I don't know, sort of had a rough life, been finished up in cardboard boxes on the street, and suddenly have this encounter of God, and the next minute they're tramping around the world, healing the sick and raising the dead. And every little Polynesian island they set foot on suddenly becomes converted to Christianity, and you think, my goodness, this must be special. These people are special. These preachers who get out there and they talk and people fall over and rush to the front. You read stories about people who come to the front having a word with the preacher and having a challenge towards him, and then he just says one word and the next minute they're on the floor blubbing like babies and giving their lives to Christ. And you think, that doesn't happen to me. And so somehow that reinforces this idea that there are these levels, although we know it's the same spirit, that somehow there are a better quality Christians who have more of a gift. And the second thing, really, is we sometimes see gifts, although we know they come from God, we see them in the eyes of the world. They've got to be gifts that we recognize. We've got to be a great musician, really, to be an anointed worship leader. We've got to be a brilliant communicator to be a preacher. We've got to have somehow this discernment to be a member of the pastoral team. You know, these people who can see into people's minds. God gives them a word and suddenly it breaks them apart. Or these prayer warriors that you read about in the books. I was up at 4 o'clock in the morning in the middle of my 8-hour prayer session. You think, 8 hours? Am I the only person who's fallen asleep at a prayer meeting? Sat around with your hand in it and just dozed off, and people think you're slain in the spirit till you start snoring. Am I the only one who's ever done that? But then you read these things about people, oh yes, I get up and have my 5 hours quiet time, and then the Lord speaks to me. And you think, well, that doesn't seem to be me. And it's hard to escape this fact that somehow to participate, to get involved, you've got to have some special spirit. We know it's not true, but it always seems that way. And right underpinning that is something that rises at the core of human nature, and that's low self-esteem, because ultimately we don't really like ourselves that much. I don't know. It seems like there's a magnet in us that attracts negatives, and we believe the negatives rather than the positives. You know what I mean? I can talk all I like about feedback to messages, but I know that if 10 people lined up at the end of this message and the first 9 say, that were brilliant, number 10 comes in and say, that were rubbish, it was really boring, didn't understand a word of it, I think you're a fake. That's the one I'll remember. That's the one that it's 10% of the feedback, but it becomes 100% of the stuff that messes in your head. Because really, we're not that fond of ourselves when we get down to it. We don't like analysis because of, we're a bit worried about what we might find. Now, I've been thinking of titles for this message. I'm not very good on titles. I know Adam's going to come at me at the end and say, what's the title of this, so we can put it on YouTube. And I'm hopeless at titles. So I've been playing about with a few titles. I need a bit of help on this one. And I thought, well, okay, how about don't let your circumstances define who you are? How about that? Because that's something we do. We are defined by circumstances. Things are going well, we think we're great, Christianity is buzzing for us. We hit a problem and suddenly we're down in the dumps, and God has left us, doesn't like us anymore, and we're miserable. We go up and down, up and down, up and down. We are defined by the circumstances within our lives. So I thought about that. But it's not really a very snappy title, is it? It's not one that would drag me in to listen to it on YouTube. So I thought, well, why don't I make the title a little bit closer to what we're talking about in terms of standing in the gap? What about this one? Why we need people, and why people need us. See, it's a two-way thing, isn't it? It's not a matter, I hope people don't see standing in the gap as being strong, tough Christians, standing in the gap for people who've got problems. I would hate people to imagine that when me and Liz go into prison each week, going as strong people who have got their lives sorted to help poor guys who are struggling with drink and drugs and crime and all that sort of stuff, to tell them how to live lives a bit more like we do. Hope it's not that. And we tell the guys when they come in on a Thursday morning that you're coming to church. For those 2 hours that you come in that morning, you're coming to church. We may not do the worship, and we may not have a formal preach and have stained glass windows, but we've got God at the center of stuff, and lots of people arrive at the meeting, and they're all in different places spiritually. Some are fired up Christians, others are really at the beginning of the journey, but that's really what it's about, and everybody brings something. Some people come in and they're really excited, and others come and they're down in the dumps. And sometimes those people who are down in the dumps become the focus of the meeting. We spend the whole meeting kind of bringing them up, lifting them up by encouraging them. Because you know that next week, once they've been lifted up, they will be lifting somebody else up who that week is down. And it works that way, and that's why it's so exciting. Everybody is lifting people up or being lifted up. And that's why we look at these guys and we call them friends and we call them family, because that's why we love going. One of the reasons we love going. And church can be like that, can't it? If we are come prepared to lift each other up and to be lifted up by others. So I thought, well, shall I have that as a title? Because that's really quite close to what I want to bring out here. And those are the things that I wanted to bring out. Those are the three reasons why we need people, and people need us. Encourage and motivate us, protect and support us, and to fight alongside us. We want people to do all those things for us, and we need to be doing those things for other people as well. It's a two-way process. But on the other hand, I thought, wait a minute, perhaps I should just, because even that's not very snappy, but perhaps I should just use the title of the guy that I want to speak about, because his name could just be the title. He's got a brilliant name, the guy I want to put at the center of this. And what I want to talk about is this guy, Mephibosheth. Oh, great. What a name, that. Mephibosheth. Why need a title when you've got that? What a brilliant name that is in a world where some Christian parents want to name their kids biblical characters but don't want the common ones, Peter, James, John, that sort of thing. Crack on with that one. Imagine that. Mephibosheth. See, Micah, you missed out on that one, mate, didn't you? You've got the Old Testament prophet, but you could have had that. What status that would have given you. Can you imagine striding into a room there, mate? The name's Bolton. Mephibosheth Bolton. They'd have remembered you for that one. So who is this guy, Mephibosheth? Or perhaps my title should be Mephibosheth. Try saying that without your teeth in. Mephibosheth. Who was this guy? Well, he's the only guy in the Bible to be introduced in brackets. The only guy to be introduced in brackets. And normally, when you use brackets in English, it's a kind of afterthought. It's to sort of fill in something that's not necessary just to keep people up to speed. It's like saying, yeah, I was talking to Fred yesterday, and people look at you and, yeah, Fred. And you put in brackets. You know Fred. Runs the corner shop, married to Gladys. Big guy, ginger hair, does karaoke down the pub. And they go, oh, yeah, I get him. And then you can now move on with the important bit. It's just kind of slotted in there. And Mephibosheth is introduced in the Bible in brackets. So is he an unimportant guy? Well, he shouldn't be really, because he's got a great parentage. He's a great lineage. His genealogy is quite dramatic. He's the grandson of King Saul, the first king of Israel. And his father, Saul's son, is a guy called Jonathan. And Jonathan is one of the Bible's really good guys. I mean, there's chapters devoted to Jonathan, to his exploits in military terms, and his character. He's a great, noble character. And so Mephibosheth comes from a line of people who are nobility. I mean, he's a prince. He has potential, if you like, to be the next king of Israel, somewhere along the line. Nobody's heard of him, though, because Mephibosheth's life changes. He's a guy who would tell you exactly what it's like to be defined by circumstances. Now, sometimes when we go into prison and you want to get guys talking about, you can't chit-chat with guys in prison. You can't talk about the weather because they're not that interested. It's cold out there. Well, we're not out there. We're in here. As long as the heat is turned up in the prison, that's all they want to know. And you can't chit-chat about stuff like, are you doing anything exciting at the weekend? Or where are you going on your holidays? Because that just winds them up, you know. So you have to get to the real issues. And so sometimes the new guy comes into the group, will say things like, well, look, if your life was a DVD, where would you wind it back to make a different choice? Because if you're in prison and you've been doing drugs and crime and so on, something's gone wrong. So where did it go wrong? When you go back, where was the point at which something happened that just pushed you in the wrong direction? A tragedy happened, a choice you made. And most of these guys will go back to some point in their childhood in the end that's all about rejection, abuse, something like that. Now, Mephibosheth could tell you exactly when his life changed, when he was 5. And the whole circumstances of his life swung around in the opposite direction. And that's what we read about when he's introduced. And this is the first appearance of Mephibosheth. 2 Samuel 4, verse 4. There's the brackets around it. And it says this: Jonathan, son of Saul, had a son who was lame in both feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. His nurse picked him up and fled, but as she hurried to leave, he fell and became disabled. His name was Mephibosheth. A name in brackets. The news that came from Jezreel, the battle against the Philistines, was in the consequence, in the aftermath of that, the king Saul was dead. And the son Jonathan had also been killed in battle. And as was the habit then, I would guess, that once you killed the head of the family, you went after the son and the grandsons, wipe out the whole family. Mephibosheth becomes a target, a potential target. So his nurse obviously panics, tries to rush him off to safety somewhere, but in the panic of that, something happens, an accident drops him, whatever it is, and he becomes damaged in the feet and becomes a cripple for the rest of his life. So Mephibosheth's life changes dramatically on that day. He goes from having a family to being an orphan. He goes from being a prince to being a pauper. He's taken it to hide into a place called Lo-Debar, which means a barren place. From the center of things to obscurity. From having potential to be a guy whose life is defined in brackets. Mephibosheth, the cripple. Ever had that happen to you? Where something in your life just defines you? I mean, guys we talk to in prison do. They'll know it. Oh, so-and-so, the alcoholic. So-and-so, the addict. So-and-so, the ex-con. But sometimes we can have the same kind of thing in brackets that attaches to us. So-and-so, the person who can't cope with relationships. Me, the person with the anger problem. Me, the one who never achieves anything. Me, the second-class Christian who couldn't be out there doing stuff because it's not me. Me, the failure. Me, the one who never gets it done. We can attach these labels to ourselves and we can live in brackets. Well, Mephibosheth, for 20 years, lives with his life in those brackets. Mephibosheth, the one who could have been, but is now Mephibosheth, the cripple. What Mephibosheth doesn't know, of course, is that hanging over his life from before he was born is a promise. Is a promise. And not just any old promise either, but the promise of a king. Now, to understand what that promise was, we have to go back in time. It's a promise that hung over Mephibosheth's life through all circumstances. From when he was a prince in the palace to when he was a pauper in a barren place. It's unchanging because it's the promise of a king. And to find out where it originates, we have to go back to the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel, and the relationship between Mephibosheth's father and David. Now, David spent a lot of his time being pursued by the grandfather Saul, who was jealous of him and wanted to kill him. But Jonathan, in a very real sense, stood in the gap for David. He protected him. He stood between his father Saul and David to protect him, to look after him. And as a result of that, he extracted from David a promise. And this is the promise. 1 Samuel 20, verse 14 says this. Jonathan speaking. But show me unfailing kindness like the Lord's kindness as long as I live, and do not ever cut off your kindness from my family. Not even when the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, may the Lord call David's enemies to account. And Jonathan had David reaffirm his oath out of love for him, because he loved him as he loved himself. That promise hangs over Mephibosheth's life. Look kindly upon my family when you come into your kingdom. It's the promise of a king. And it's more than just a promise. It's called a covenant. A binding agreement. And it's a binding agreement that's born out of love. Do we see its application to the world in which we live? See, there's a world out there that lives defined by its circumstances. I'm happy, I'm doing well. I'm doing badly, I'm miserable. I'm living a great life, I'm living a rubbish life. I'm just clinging onto it by my fingertips. Defined by circumstances. People who are living this great life and suddenly the Honda factory shuts down. Suddenly they're redundant, and suddenly the circumstances of their life change. Up and down, up and down, up and down. And hanging over the whole of humanity is a promise. Not just any promise either, but the promise of a king. We've got it on the board above that. Romans 10. That if you believe in God and you realize that God raised him from the dead and Jesus is your Lord, you will be saved. There is the promise that hangs over the whole of humanity. It hangs over every one of us. That you will be saved. It may not change all the circumstances. It may not turn Mephibosheth into a guy who runs a marathon. He may still be a cripple, but it hangs over his life, changing everything. It's the same promise that the thief on the cross extracted from Jesus moments before he died. Remember me when you come into your kingdom. Remember me with kindness. He was still going to die, but it changes everything. The only problem is, of course, that Mephibosheth doesn't know it. Neither of the people out in the world know it, which is why we've got to tell them. We've got to tell them that there is a promise out there, a promise of a king that changes everything. And that gives me a possible title, does it? I don't know about this one. Mephibosheth and the King's Promise. Oh no, you can feedback late and tell me what title seems to go well with this, as long as you don't use the word rubbish. Mephibosheth and the King's Promise. Perhaps that's the title for it. So, David remembers this promise. There's a time in David's life where the kingdom seems to be going well. He's there in Jerusalem. Everything seems to be sorted. And he thinks back to the glory of God and the people who helped him get there, people like Jonathan. And he says, well, I wonder if anybody is still alive, if Saul's relatives are still alive, that I can show this kindness to. And he sends for a servant, one of Saul's former servants, a guy called Ziba. And he says, is there anybody still alive? And Ziba tells him about Mephibosheth, the cripple. And David says, send for the son. See, there's a difference in perspective, isn't there? People see the brackets, the cripple, the definition. David sees Mephibosheth, the son. There's a difference of perspective. And Mephibosheth is brought to Jerusalem. And this is the meeting of the two of them. 2 Samuel 9, 6-8. When Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. David said, Mephibosheth, at your service, he replied. Don't be afraid, David said to him, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. Mephibosheth bowed down and said, what is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? When Mephibosheth learns of the promise, he doesn't get it. He reacts like we do. What is God that he could be mindful of some miserable dead dog like me, some miserable worm? How could God show his grace towards somebody as useless as me? We don't get it. Mephibosheth doesn't get it. The king says, you will eat at my table. Mephibosheth said, you're kidding. Not me. We don't get it. We cannot understand the full grace of God, which is why we need to be reminded. Which is why we need to be reminded over and over and over again that we can eat at the table. We can't go into prison, Liz and I can't go into prison and simply say to these guys who are living, the victims in circumstances of their rejection, and simply say, guess what? God loves you. And guess what? When we tell them that, they don't get it. Which is why we have to go in the next week as well, and the week after, and the week after, and 52 weeks a year. Because while it would be nice if these guys got this message straight away, sometimes we need to repeat it over and over again. And the first reason that we need people, remember, is to motivate and encourage us. Because who's going to tell us that we can eat at the table? Who's going to tell you where I am? And who's going to tell me where you are? And where are you going to tell me? When we come together in church. When we sit there drinking coffee. You're not going to tell me that it's nice weather outside. I can see that. But you're going to tell me your testimony. And I don't mean how you became a Christian. But I mean, what has God done in your life this week? What has God done in your life? So I need to know that. Because if I'm feeling down, I need you to lift me up. And then when I'm up, next week, I can lift somebody else up. Do you get how the whole thing works? We need to be reminded of that. Mephibosheth did. There's the promise. You will always eat at my table, verse 7. Now, 3 times in the next 4 or 5 verses, that promise is repeated. And it's a picture of us needing to be told again and again, because I don't get that. I don't get the fact that I can eat at the king's table. So we need reminders, and there they are. Verse 11. Now David says the promise to Ziba. See, this is Mephibosheth. Serve him. He will always eat at my table. Next verse. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Not just a person perched at the end of the table receiving the scraps. No, he was at the center of the table like one of the king's sons. And 2 verses later, so Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table. He lived in Jerusalem because it was the center of things. That's where the king's table is, so that's where he was. Mephibosheth needs reminding of it. People need reminding of it. You can't just tell God loves you. Oh, that's great. My life has now changed. We need to be told again and again and again. We need to experience it, and I need you to tell me. And you need me to tell you. That's why we come to church. I don't know how people manage without coming to church. I really don't. If you're not coming to church, who's lifting you up? Or I can be a Christian on my own, a solo Christian. You can't. No such thing as a solo Christian. You plug in to people who will lift you up, who will encourage and motivate you. So perhaps that's my title. Mephibosheth and the King's Promise. That's our first thing. The second reason, though, that we need people to protect and support us. Because guess what? We have an enemy. And the devil doesn't like you. In fact, the devil hates you. He hates everybody. And he's got a plan for everybody. And plan A is to make sure that people don't actually hear the promise. That's his best plan. Make sure they never hear it. But if that doesn't work, plan B is to make sure it never takes root. There's the parable of the sower for you. Yeah, you can be told the promise, but it can fall on stony ground. It can be choked by thorns and thistles. But if you're a Christian here this morning, those two plans have not worked for you, have they? You heard the promise, and you believed it. But that's not the end of it. The devil doesn't walk away from us and thinking, oh, messed up on that one, right, I'll go and target somebody else. He's got plan C for you. And plan C is very simple. If he can't steal your salvation from you, he'll make you unproductive. He'll make you sit at the back and do nothing. It's almost like it says, I want you to know that you could eat at the king's table, but I don't want you to actually do it. Because that's not for you. That's for special people. People who write testimony books. That's not for the likes of you. You can't eat at the king's table. Once in a while, perhaps, you can eat the crumbs. But that's not for you. That's what he'll do. And he'll make you unproductive so you do nothing. And guess what? It happens to Mephibosheth as well. The attacks now start. People wait for the opportunity and the attacks begin. There's a problem in the kingdom again. David comes under attack from one of his own sons, Absalom. And there's a rebellion, and David has to fight. And while David is away fighting and distracted, then the attacks begin. And they come from the hands, initially, of that servant, Ziba, who doesn't really like the idea of serving Mephibosheth. He was all right serving the king Saul, but not to serve his grandson, who was a cripple to boot. He didn't like that. So he stirs things. He goes to see David out there in the field where David is fighting. And he takes provisions and stuff like that. It looks really good. It looks like he's being a good guy. And then David says to him, hang on, where's Mephibosheth? Why didn't he come with you? And this is what the king, this is the comment. The king asks, the king then asks, where is your master's grandson? Ziba said to him, he is staying in Jerusalem because he thinks today the Israelites will restore to me my grandfather's kingdom. And then the king said to Ziba, all that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours. I humbly bow, Ziba said, may I find favor in your eyes, my lord, the king. See, if that's true, that's rubbish, isn't it? Mephibosheth, stopping in Jerusalem, kind of siding with Absalom against David, hoping that David will be overthrown so he could get the kingdom. If that's true, that's rubbish, that. How ungrateful is it? But of course it's not. It's a lie. It's a lie. Ziba is gossiping and spreading stuff behind Mephibosheth's back so he can get advantage. Has that ever happened to you, by the way, in your workplace? People gossiping about you behind your back, trying to get position, trying to maneuver around you, in your school, on your social media. It's happened to me and Liz in church. With people maneuvering behind your back to try and say things, to slander your reputation with a view to getting us not to go into prison anymore. It's happened, sadly. And the saddest thing of the lot is that some of the people you hope would see through it don't. And David doesn't appear to see through it. Right then, I'll take all that stuff off Mephibosheth and give it to you, Ziba. Thank you very much, says Ziba. That's exactly what I wanted. I've got what I needed. But it's a lie. This is where Mephibosheth needs people to stand with him and to watch his back. It's where we do it when people are attacking us. But can you see a problem here? How can we stand with Mephibosheth? Because if that's true, he doesn't deserve standing with. So how can we stand with him unless we know the truth? And there's our problem. Anna preached on it a few weeks ago. How can we stand with people if we don't know who they are? If they won't be open and honest with us? How can you stand with people in the church if you don't get to know them? if you don't understand who they are? How can people stand watching your back if you don't know who you are, if they never got to know you and you've never let them get to know you? It's so important, this, that you get to know people. Then, once you know the whole picture, you can stand with people. As it stands there, we don't know what the situation is. So who are we standing with? Well, I don't know. I need to inquire. Fortunately, it comes to light a little bit later. David wins the battle, goes back to Jerusalem, and confronts Mephibosheth. And it says this: Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, also went down to meet the king. He had not taken care of his feet or trimmed his moustache or washed his clothes from the day the king left until the day he returned safely. When he came from Jerusalem to meet the king asked him, "Why didn't you go with me, Mephibosheth?" Come on, you can do it. He said, "My lord king, servant and lame, I said I will have my donkey saddled and ride on it so I can go with the king. But Ziba, my servant, betrayed me. And he has slandered your servant to my lord the king. My lord the king is like an angel of God, so do whatever you wish. All my grandfather's descendants deserved nothing but death from my lord the king. But you gave your servant a place among those who eat at your table. So what right do I have to make any more appeals to the king?" There's another side to it now, isn't there? Yeah, I want you to come, but Ziba betrayed me. I couldn't saddle all this stuff up myself, so he just went and left me there. Now he's gone bad-mouthing me. Now, do you believe him? Well, I do. I mean, look at his appearance. Hasn't washed his clothes, hasn't looked after himself. That's a sign of mourning in the Old Testament. He's let his moustache grow over his upper lip. That's a sign of grief. It's something that lepers had to do in order to declare themselves unclean, to cover the lip, otherwise you shaved it. Everything about what Mephibosheth has done suggests a man who is not looking for power, but his heart is for David. Now we know a little bit more about the situation. You're better placed to make a decision on who you would stand with. And it's the same with people in the church. Once you know more about them, you're in a better place to be able to stand with them, aren't you? And the clincher is, the king said to him, "Why say more? I order you and Ziba to divide the land." Mephibosheth said to the king, "Let him take everything, now that my lord the king has returned home safely." See, I think that shows the heart of it. It's a little bit like David's son Solomon when he had to sort out that problem of two women claiming to be the mother of the same baby. And he said to them, "Well, all right, I can't make up my mind. Well, chop the child in half, have half each." Knowing that that would flush out the heart of the mother, the real mother. The real mother's heart would be revealed in that. And she would say, no, let him have it. And I think the same is true here. This is not a guy who's interested in money and power and stuff like that. His heart has been for David, and he's not about things like that. And I would stand with Mephibosheth on this and watch his back. But you can only do it once you understand the situation. Once you've got to know it. And for that, we have to put the effort in to get to know people. And people have to be open and honest with us. You get it? Now, there is a third and final reason why we need people. We need them to motivate and encourage us, to push us forward, to encourage us when we're down. And we need people to support us and watch our backs. But there's one other thing. We need people to fight alongside us. Now, I can't use Mephibosheth for this one because he's not a fighter. But I do want to make the point, and I've got to go to the book of Judges on this one, with a little detail that will tell us what I'm trying to get to here. It's a time when Israel and Judah, the two nations, were squaring up to each other, and Judah are assembling their armies for this battle. And this is what we read in Judges chapter 20. In Judah's army, among all these soldiers, there were 700 select troops who were left-handed, each of whom could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. Now, our mate Bill Wilson did a whole preach on this, the one who does Metro World Child, the one who Janine Works put out in Kenya. He did a whole message on this. It's a great message. I've got a copy of it at home if anybody wants to listen to it. But Bill's got this mind that looks at these little details and thinks, hang on, 700 left-handed soldiers with slings. That's a bit odd in a world where left-handers were regarded as misfits, second-class warriors. So he did a lot of investigation in dusty books to find out information. Couldn't find out anybody with a sensible reason. Some people were saying things like, well, you'd keep the left and the right-handed apart in case they got the slings tangled. You think, that's a bit daft. And the only reason that he discovered that made any sense was the fact that these guys were left-handed because they weren't right-handed. And they weren't right-handed because they had no right hand. Or they'd lost the use of it, or the use of the whole arm. In other words, these guys were wounded soldiers. These guys had been out in the battle, and they'd been wounded. So much so they could no longer hold a sword in their right hand. And once that happens to you, when you've been wounded in the battle, like some of the guys we meet in prison have been wounded in the battle of life, and are down, and the circumstances have defined them, you've got two options. One, you can say, well, that's me finished. I'll take a back seat and sit and watch the action from the back of a church. Or you can do what these guys did and say, well, I may not be able to use a sword anymore, but I could use my left hand, and I could use a sling. And they retrained, and they retrained, and they retrained, until they could hit a hare at 100 meters. Until they became a select fighting force. Not defined by the wounds anymore, but allowing the wounds to motivate them to get out there and make a difference. And what a difference these guys make. My word, you wouldn't want to face them, would you? 700 guys you could take you straight between the eyes with a stone at 100 meters, 700 of them. You wouldn't want to face this lot. They became cutting edge. And we say to the guys in prison sometimes that you've got a choice. When you come to Christ, with all this baggage that you've had in the past, you can remain defined by the wounds that have upset you, the poverty, the rejection. You could be defined by that and simply go and hide at the back of a church in self-pity or in self-condemnation. Or I'll tell you what, you could retrain. Doesn't happen overnight, but you could retrain, and you could be the very people that God wants to send back in time into the prisons, into the colleges, into the schools, out there into the workplaces, out onto the streets, because what you have is a message that people need to hear. And you could be an elite fighting force, the next generation of cutting-edge evangelists with a message to tell to people out there who are suffering from the same wounds. And that's a choice. We can look at how life has treated us and we can back off from it. And we can simply look at ourselves, or else we can say, no, I'm not having this. I'm going to go on the attack. I'm going to be part of an elite fighting force. And that's why we need people. Because one left-handed guy with a sling can cause some damage. David did for Goliath. But 700 of them, or a church of them, can make a difference, can't it? If we're up for it. And that's it, really. 3 things. Standing in the gap for people, to encourage and motivate them, and to be motivated. To protect and support people, and to be protected and supported. But for that, people will need to know who we are, take every opportunity to get to know people. And to be honest and open with people. You cannot support somebody. We've had it with guys in prison who, when they come out, will say, I'm doing fine. There's nothing you can do with guys like, yeah, okay, that's great. But in fact, they're walking backwards to the edge of a cliff, heading towards a relapse, heading back to prison. But they won't tell you, and you can't help them. In the end, they fall off the end of a cliff. They're back inside, and they said, I should have told you. I should have been more open and honest, shouldn't I? Bit late then, when you've lost 5 years of your life. So be open and honest while we've got the chance. Let people know. Then they can support you. And together, we could be left-handed soldiers. No matter what your circumstances are, no matter what you've been defined by. Right-handed soldiers, fine, but left-handed soldiers, not defined by the wounds of the world, but motivated. Motivated to make a difference. And that's, if you like, Mephibosheth and the promise of a king. Let's pray. Father, I thank you. I thank you for your word. I thank you for the awesome privilege, really, of being together, of being allowed to come together. Pray, Father, that you will challenge us to encourage each other, to allow ourselves to be encouraged, to allow people to know us as you know us, tell people who we are. Don't let us hide our weaknesses. Don't let me be these people who cover stuff up. Let's be willing to take advice. Let us be willing, Father, for you to work in us through other people who stand in the gap for us, Father, and give us this heart that we can take on the battle that you placed us in. Let us no longer, Father, believe that somehow the battle is only to be fought by those people who are special and set apart for the purpose, because you have set us apart for that same purpose. It's the same Spirit, Lord, and we commit, Lord, to doing what we can in that battle. In Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you, folks. Alfred, do you want to